it's really hard to pinpoint these things because you start, our musical lives typically start in performance in some way.
Hmm.
Well, our musical lives really start with listening,
Yeah.
right? And we learn to listen. And when we learn to listen, sometimes we learn to expect things. And that's what makes some things a surprise to us. And so I would say being surprised by things that I've heard were probably my first years of artistic experience of being a composer, because I was actively listening to something in a different way, although I didn't make it. And everyone has stories about banging on pots and pans or something at home. When I was 7, I joined a community sort of drum group. It was like a drum corps in Northern Virginia. And I was really excited about the snare drum sound. I wasn't playing the snare drum. I wasn't good enough, but I was really excited about the sound. And I remember going home and I was determined to find something that sounded just like a snare drum. And I had a tin Charlie Brown lunchbox, now it's an antique lunchbox.
Yeah.
I still have it, and it has dents in it from where
That's awesome.
I was convinced that it sounded like so much like a snare drum that I brought it with me to the next meeting and showed the teacher of this thing. It was like, I found something at my house that sounds just like a snare drum, so I've been practicing snare drum parts. Um, but I didn't have snare drum parts to practice, so I made up my own. And at that time, it was like cadences, right? Like this is like a
Yeah.
group that would march in parades, like a bunch of little kids with the baton twirlers and flags and a little drum line, right? And so I distinctly remember sitting there playing on that Charlie Brown lunchbox, making up music, but not really realizing that I wasn't trying to compose necessarily, but I was imitating the things that some of the older kids were doing that I remembered from like being in that, rehearsal or whatever. So that was second grade. Okay. It wasn't until sixth grade that I decided I should write, like, maybe I could write some of these things down. So I actually wrote my first piece in sixth grade that was like fully notated. It was a snare drum solo. I was studying then at the time. I started taking private lessons with the same teacher who was running that community group. He became my private teacher, and I brought him a piece of staff paper with my pencil writing on it that was a snare drum solo I wrote, and I was really excited to show it to him, and we played it together.
Oh, that's awesome.
And actually, like, I mostly had the right amount of beats and all the measures and stuff. And so that's my earliest memory of composing, of like organizing music in my own way, on a it doesn't have to be on a piece of paper, but for me it turned into me like notating on a staff paper. I don't even know where I got the staff paper from. I think my older sister's boyfriend gave me a piece of staff paper, or maybe my older sister did. She was in high school band at the time. But I should say that teacher who I met when I was 7, I studied with weekly until I graduated from high school. It turns out I got really lucky in that the area that I grew up in, I was surrounded by members of various military bands. We were in Northern Virginia, right outside of DC. And this guy, whose name is Miles Overton, was a percussion section member of the U.S. Army band Pershing Zone. And he was just working with this group as a volunteer. He was just giving his time to this little community drum group. And I had no idea I was like in the presence of a completely legitimate and outstanding musician.
Yeah, right.
And so I had the fortune of studying with him all the way through high school, eventually adding a second teacher. At the time I was going to be a drummer, I was going to be a percussionist. I was composing. I wrote a little snare drum piece in 6th grade. I wrote a couple other pieces. I wrote a bunch of percussion music, and then eventually I wrote a solo piano piece. I remember the title, but I won't say it. It's embarrassing. It was a
We
kind of
all
title you think that like an 8th grader would come up with,
Yeah, we all have those, right?
And and then when I started learning about music theory, somehow or another, one of the music teachers at my school suggested that I write a song for voice and piano, and so I was also really into poetry and reading pretty much all through high school and even 8th grade onwards. And so I set a poem by William Blake called "A Poison Tree," and that was my first art song. That was my first like song that I wrote that wasn't for me because I wasn't a singer and I wasn't a pianist. And somebody in my like theory class performed it for the class. And that was the first time I had the experience of like writing something that I couldn't do, giving it to someone else, and then hearing them do it. And that was a lot of fun. But that's what it was. It was fun. Composing was always fun for me. It wasn't really a choice. It wasn't something I decided like I want to be a composer. You know,
Yeah.
I was a percussionist. I was a musician, and composing was something I did for fun. I used some of those skills that I gained as a musician and through theory classes and playing in various school bands and stuff like that to on the side write some things.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Micromaker by Loose Leaf Transmissions. We hope you enjoyed this brief glimpse into the inner workings of the creative life. If this resonated with you, be sure to check out the full conversation on Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast exploring craft and process, philosophy and inspiration, and the honest, often messy parts of being an artist, creative uncertainty, purpose and identity, and resilience. You can find Music Maker wherever you get your podcasts or by visiting musicmakerpodcast.com.